Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Fernandes. I'm an associate professor of marketing at Catholic University of Portugal. I will present my paper, Politics at the Mall, the Moral Foundations of Boycotts. So the premise of this paper is that all individuals engage in boycotts, but in ways that are consistent with their moral values. The second premise is that liberals display a more positive attitude towards boycotts in general. This is because liberals and conservatives prioritize different moral values. While conservatives prioritize purity, group loyalty, and authority moral values, liberals prioritize harm and fairness moral values. This drives conservatives to be concerned with their family, their in-group, their shared social in-group, be that their family, relationships, class, or country. While liberals are more concerned with equality, justice, individualizing moral values, and therefore they are more sensitive toward larger and more permeable groups, including humans, animals, and even plants. So liberals, they express concern toward more permeable groups, right? Be that animals, other humans, and plants, whereas conservatives are more concerned with their shared social in-group. This will drive liberals and conservatives to have different reactions to companies' actions, and will also drive liberals to have more positive attitude towards boycotts because they're more likely to boycott for different reasons, right? Whereas conservatives will boycott to protect their shared social in-group. So this drives those two hypotheses. Conservatives and liberals will engage in consumer political actions that are associated with their values. Conservatives will engage in boycotts that are associated with binding moral values, those values that represent concern for the shared social in-group, whereas liberals will engage in boycotts that express concern towards harm and fairness, the individualizing moral values. This different prioritization of moral values will also drive liberals to boycott more, because they will because boycotts are more strongly associated with individualizing moral values, right? Because individualizing moral values drive this concern towards larger groups. Whereas conservatives will engage in boycotts, but in less strongly, because they express concern towards their shared social in-group, and boycotts will be less associated with that. So the first study measured the tendency to boycott or boycott Nike because of the Kaepernick campaign. So I expect that liberals will be in favor of the campaign because they have harm and fairness moral priorities, whereas conservatives will be against the campaign because the Kaepernick expressed his discontent with police brutality by kneeling during the national anthem, and this can be interpreted by conservatives as a disrespect towards the American flag. So I expect liberals and conservatives to have opposing reactions because they are different prioritization of moral values. So participants first answered the ideology scale of Kiddo and colleagues. Then they were asked to consider Nike's campaign of using Kaepernick as a product endorser. And then they were asked to indicate how likely they were to boycott and to purposefully boycott the products of the company from not at all to very much. As expected, I find opposing reactions of liberals and conservatives. On the x-axis is political ideology, from one very liberal to 9 very conservative, and in the y-axis is the intention to boycott and boycott Nike. As expected, liberals were more likely to boycott the Nike, to purposefully buy the products of Nike because of the campaign, as they endorsed the campaign, whereas conservatives were more likely to boycott Nike because of the campaign, as they reject the campaign, given their moral concerns. Study 2, I aim to replicate these results in the context of Brexit in the UK. Conservatives, they tend to reject companies that that oppose Brexit. So conservatives endorse Brexit, whereas liberals, they tend to reject companies that reject Brexit, right? So they tend to conservatives are oppose Brexit. Therefore, I expect those different reactions towards companies that reject or oppose Brexit, given their moral concerns. So in the study, participants answered the ideology scale from 1 extremely left-wing to 9 extremely right-wing, and then they were asked to indicate how likely they were to boycott a brand if it publicly supports or opposes Brexit, from 0, not at all, to 7, very much. And as expected, I find opposing reactions of liberals and conservatives. Liberal in the y-axis is, again, political ideology from 1 very left-wing to 9 very right-wing. I didn't find any extremely right-wing individual in the data, so the scale goes from, the actual scale goes from 1 to 8. The data goes from 1 to 8. And what I find consistent with the expectation is that liberals are more likely to boycott a brand that supports Brexit, right? Whereas conservatives are more likely to boycott a brand that opposes Brexit. Okay. As liberals are more in favor of Brexit, right? So if a brand opposes Brexit, they are more likely to boycott it. Conservatives, in turn, they are against the Brexit, right? So they are more likely to boycott a brand that supports Brexit. Okay. In study 3, I aim to expand the number of boycotts of liberals and conservatives. So I looked at 14 recent boycotts of liberals and 14 recent boycotts of conservatives. I expect, again, those opposing reactions of liberals and conservatives, and I expect that the moral priorities will mediate those effects, right? I expect that the moral priorities will explain the boycotts of liberals and conservatives. So participants first answered the ideology scale from extremely left-wing to 9 extreme right-wing. Then they were asked to consider 14 recent conservative boycotts and 14 recent liberal boycotts. Then they answered whether they would boycott, neither boycott or boycott, or boycott for each one of those boycotts. And then they answered the moral foundations questionnaire. Okay. Those were the conservative boycotts, and those were the liberal boycotts. So participants answered whether they would boycott or neither for each one of those boycotts. And I measured the number of times that they reported that they would boycott each one of those boycotts. What I find is that the moral values mediate the effect of political ideology on boycott in liberal boycotts, and boycott and boycott in liberal boycotts, and boycott in conservative boycotts, meaning that the prioritization of different moral values explain the effects of political ideology on boycott and boycott in liberal and conservative boycotts. Study 4, I replicate those results with a sample of American employed workers. Study 5, I aim to test the effect on attitude towards boycotts. So the prediction again is that both liberals and conservatives will engage in boycotts, but that liberals will have a more positive attitude towards boycotts. And the prioritization of individualizing moral values will explain this tendency of these more positive attitudes towards boycotts among liberals. So participants first answered the ideology scale, then they answered the moral foundations questionnaire, then they answered their attitude towards a boycott scale, and finally they answered whether they have boycotted or boycotted a brand in the past. When I find consistent with the previous results that both liberals and conservatives boycott, I find a strong non-linear effect that both extreme liberals and extreme conservatives are more likely to boycott relative to those in the middle. This is true for boycott and for boycott. Okay. On the y-axis is the likelihood of having boycotted in the past from 0 to 1, and here on panel B is the likelihood of having boycotted in the past from 0 to 1. I also find that liberals have a more positive attitude towards boycotts, right? So despite the fact that both liberals and conservatives engage in boycott, liberals have a more positive generalized attitude towards boycotts. And finally, I find that the prioritization of individualizing moral values lead to a more positive attitude towards boycotts, which then lead to an effect of liberals being more likely to boycott. So even though I find that the likelihood of boycott happens in both extremes of the political spectrum, it's slightly stronger among liberals. And I find that this is because liberals have a more positive attitude towards boycotts. And this is also because liberals express concern towards more permeable groups, right? Including animals and even plants. Whereas conservatives, they tend to be concerned with their shared social in-group, right? And therefore liberals have a more positive attitude towards boycotts in general. Okay. So study 6 replicates this effect with in the word value survey. So the word value survey measures whether people's tendency to boycott. So it's a one item measure about whether people have never joined a boycott, 1, might join a boycott, 2, and have joined a boycott in the past, 3. And so I find a nonlinear effect replicating the effect that liberals have more positive attitude towards boycotts, right? They have stronger boycott tendency. In the x-axis is political ideology from 1 very liberal to 10 very conservative. Sorry, extremely left-wing 1, extremely right-wing 10. Study 7 tests the causal effect of political ideology. So I used the manipulation of Ordabayev and Fernandez, in which participants recall a conversation they had with someone that was either more conservative or liberal than they are. And the intuition here is that this social contrast will drive participants to perceive that they are either more liberal or conservative. So imagine a case in which you have a conversation with someone that express very conservative beliefs, such as someone who thinks that criminals should be killed. So conservatives tend to think that we should be harsher on criminals, right? So imagine a situation in which you had such a conversation. You will perceive yourself at least momentarily more liberal, right, than that person, and slightly more liberal in general. So this manipulation was shown to be successful by driving people to experience themselves as more liberal or conservative, at least in a slight amount, in a short amount of time. Then participants answered the ideology scale from extremely left-wing to extremely right-wing in the attitude towards boycott scale. And the results show that the manipulation had an effect on the ideology scale as a manipulation check, and also on the attitude towards boycott scale. More specifically, that the conservatives, those in the conservative condition report more conservative self-identification, and they report that they are less, they report lower attitude towards boycotts. Liberals, those in the liberal condition reports more positive attitude towards boycotts. Finally, study 8, I test the effect of political ideology on political activism more broadly. So I used the data from the Measuring Morality project of Duke University, in which they measure whether respondents attended a political protest or rally in the past 12 months. So that's the variable in the Y axis. They also measure political ideology from 1 to 7. 1 is extremely liberal and 7 is extremely conservative. And I replicate the previous finding, this previous non-linear effect that that political protest is observed at both extremes of the political ideology scale, both among liberals and among conservatives relative to those in the middle, but that liberals are especially more likely to engage in those actions. So conclusions, the key conclusion of this research is that conservatives also engage in boycotts and political protests, albeit less strongly than liberals do. Okay? So this adds nuance to previous findings that only liberals engage in boycotts. And no, I find that both liberals and conservatives do, but liberals a bit more strongly than conservatives. Liberals and conservatives engage in boycotts and boycotts for different reasons. Conservatives engage in boycotts and boycotts that are associated with binding moral values. Liberals engage in boycotts and boycotts that are associated with individualizing moral values. So both liberals and conservatives engage in boycotts, and they do for their prioritization of their moral values. Finally, liberals have a more positive general attitude towards boycotts, as they extend their moral concern to more permeable groups by prioritizing harm and fairness moral values. The implication is that politicians seeking support of companies and companies supporting politicians need to consider the nature of boycotts that companies were involved with. So the political orientation of both companies and politicians and their customer base, right? So to conclude, I believe this research aimed to understand the boycotts and boycotts of liberals and conservatives, right? And to understand why they perform such actions, right? Liberals tend to engage in boycotts that advance individual rights, right? The individualizing moral values of harm and care, and therefore they boycott more, right? They boycott to protect plants and animals, whereas conservatives, they tend to engage in boycotts that protect their shared social in-group, right? And therefore they boycott less, right? They boycott for specific reasons that address their moral values. Okay, so with that, I hope I was able to advance the understanding of the behavior of liberals and conservatives regarding their consumer political actions. Okay. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the questions.